The name fell across the harvest table like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple it made changed Della Aldridge's life forever. She had been sitting at the far end of the long oak table for the better part of an hour, surrounded by the smells of roasted corn and fresh-baked bread, by the sounds of laughter and the scraping of tin plates, by the warmth of 40 strangers who had looked through her as though she were made of glass. Not one of them had asked her name. Not one of them had passed the salt her way without her reaching for it first. She had been invisible in the way that only a woman alone in a strange territory can be invisible, swallowed whole, by the sheer indifference of people who have their own lives and their own histories and their own reasons to celebrate. The Hargrove Ranch Harvest Supper was the social event of the autumn season in Caldwell County, Kansas, 1883. Tables had been dragged out onto the flat ground behind the barn, and lanterns strung between the fence posts threw gold light across faces she did not know. Della had arrived with the Hargrove family because she had been hired 3 weeks ago as a seamstress and occasional domestic helper, brought out from St. Joseph, Missouri, by a letter of employment that had promised fair wages and honest work. What the letter had not promised, and what no one had thought to mention, was that she would spend those 3 weeks eating at the kitchen table alone, sleeping in the tack room converted into a washroom, and attending a harvest supper at which she was not a guest but merely a body occupying a chair. And then Milton Merritt spoke. He was seated near the center of the table, and he had been in conversation with Ezra Hargrove about the price of cattle at the Dodge City yards when something made him look up. His eyes moved down the length of the table with the quiet, unhurried assessment of a man who has learned to see what others miss, and they stopped on her. He did not look away. He did not turn back to Ezra. He set his fork down on the edge of his plate with a soft click that somehow, in the strange acoustics of that particular moment, she heard all the way from where she was sitting. "Della Aldridge," he said, not loudly, not as an announcement. He said it the way you say a word you have been turning over in your mind for a long time and have finally decided is the right one. He said it to the table at large, to no one and everyone, and the effect was immediate and total. Every face turned. Every conversation paused. Every person at that table who had spent the last hour pretending she did not exist was suddenly forced to look directly at her because Milton Merritt had made her real. "You know her," Ezra Hargrove said, and there was something in his voice that Della could not quite name. Surprise, yes, but something else beneath it, something that sat wrong. Milton Merritt looked at Ezra, and then he looked back at Della, and his expression was the most complicated thing she had ever seen on a man's face. There was recognition in it. There was something that might have been relief, and there was something that looked very much like the beginning of a reckoning. "I know of her," Milton said carefully, "and I think someone at this table owes her a proper introduction, starting with why she was brought here." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and texture and temperature. Della felt it press against her chest. She looked at Milton Merritt, this man she had never met, this cattle rancher with sun-darkened skin and steady gray eyes, and she felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the Kansas earth and everything to do with the fact that someone had finally said her name out loud. What happened in the next few minutes would begin the most important and most dangerous chapter of her life. But to understand why, you have to understand how Della Aldridge came to be sitting at the end of that table in the first place, invisible and alone, in a land where she knew no one and no one claimed to know her. The summer of 1883 had not been kind to St. Joseph, Missouri. The city was changing, pressing forward into a new decade with the restless energy of a place trying to forget what it had been, and the women who had made their livings in the needle trades were feeling it in their wages and their prospects. Della had been the best seamstress in the shop where she worked, quick and precise, with a particular gift for reading the shape of a garment before she cut the cloth. She had been 26 years old, unattached, and privately terrified that unattached was how she would remain. Her mother had died when Della was 17, her father when she was 22, and the years in between and after had been shaped entirely by her own hands and her own decisions. She was not a woman given to self-pity. She was, however, a woman given to honesty, and the honest truth was that she was tired of the narrow life the city was offering her. She was tired of the small room above the dry goods store on Francis Street. She was tired of eating supper alone and waking alone and going to sleep with nothing but the sound of the street below her window. When the advertisement appeared in the St. Joseph Gazette in late July of 1883, Della read it 3 times before she let herself believe it was real. A ranching family in Caldwell County, Kansas, near the Kisham Trail corridor, was seeking a skilled seamstress and domestic assistant. Room and board provided. Fair wages. Letter of character required. Apply to the Hargrove Ranch, care of the County Post. She wrote the letter of application herself, in the clear, steady hand her mother had taught her, and she sent it with a character reference from her employer at the needle shop. 3 weeks later, she received a reply from a woman who signed herself as Mrs. Constance Hargrove, inviting Della to come out and take up the position. The letter was warm enough. It spoke of a busy household and honest work and the clean air of the frontier. It did not mention that Mrs. Constance Hargrove had died of a fever the previous spring. Della did not discover this until she stepped off the stage at Caldwell on a blazing afternoon in late August, her trunk and her sewing basket her only companions, and found Ezra Hargrove waiting for her with a wagon and an expression that could only be described as calculating. Ezra was 41 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a wide jaw and small eyes that had the quality of always appearing to be measuring something. He had shaken her hand, loaded her trunk without speaking, and driven her the 12 miles out to the ranch without offering a single word of explanation about the letter she had received or the woman who had supposedly written it. She had asked about Mrs. Hargrove on the second day, carefully, while she was doing the mending in the kitchen. Ezra's housekeeper, a gray-haired woman named Bertie who came in 3 days a week from a neighboring farm, had gone very still at the question and then said, very quietly, that Mrs. Hargrove had passed in April and that she was sorry Della hadn't been told. Della had set down the shirt she was mending and breathed through the cold feeling in her chest for a long moment. Then she had asked why she had received a letter signed by a dead woman, and Bertie had looked at the kitchen door and said she didn't know anything about that, and she thought it best not to ask. Ezra Hargrove had not hired her as a seamstress. Or rather, he had hired her as a seamstress the way a man buys a horse and calls it a pet. The real purpose of her presence at the Hargrove Ranch was something that became clearer with every passing day, and that Della, being an honest woman, was not willing to pretend she didn't see. Ezra had brought her here to fill the space his wife had left, not the emotional space, the practical one. He wanted a woman to run his household, to be available and useful and permanent, and he had constructed the seamstress position as a trap because he knew that no woman with any sense would come out to the frontier solely to marry a widower she had never met. He had not made any explicit declaration. He was too careful for that. But the pattern of small gestures and quiet assumptions had been building for 3 weeks, and by the night of the harvest supper, Della was fully aware of the situation she was in and fully uncertain about how to get out of it. She was 1,000 miles from home with $23 in her purse and no stage ticket back and no clear plan, and the man who held the only steady roof over her head in this county had intentions she did not share. She had come to the harvest supper because she had no choice. She had sat at the end of the table because that was where she had been placed. And she had been invisible because Ezra Hargrove had arranged it that way. She was beginning to understand. He had not introduced her to his neighbors. He had not explained who she was or why she was there. He was keeping her in a state of social isolation that would make her more dependent on him and less able to build any kind of independent foundation in this community. And then Milton Merritt had said her name. The story of how Milton Merritt knew the name Della Aldridge before they had ever spoken a word to each other was not a simple one, and it would not be told all at once. It would be told in pieces, the way most important truths are told, as the circumstances demanded and as the trust between two people deepened enough to hold the weight of it. What Della knew, sitting at that harvest table in the sudden bright attention of 40 strangers, was that this man had done something extraordinary. He had reached across a room full of comfortable indifference, and he had pulled her into existence. He had made her matter. And whatever his reasons were, whatever this reckoning was that she saw forming in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his gaze, she was grateful in a way that went bone-deep and immediate and took her completely by surprise. After Milton's statement, the supper reassembled itself slowly, the way conversations do when a moment of tension has passed and no one quite wants to acknowledge what just happened. People began to introduce themselves. The woman across from Della, a farmer's wife named Agnes Caldwell, reached across the table and shook her hand warmly and said she was very pleased to meet her, and did she sew women's things or men's things because Agnes had a dress that needed letting out at the waist if Della had the time. The man beside Milton, who turned out to be the county land agent, said a few words about the harvest and the fine weather they'd been having. Ezra Hargrove said nothing at all. He ate his supper with focused attention and did not look at Milton Merritt, which was itself a form of looking at him. Milton Merritt caught Della's eye exactly once during the remainder of the supper, and what passed between them in that glance was not a romantic thing, not yet, but a question and an answer, a testing of the air between them. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before looking away, which was long enough to say, "I see you. I am not afraid of you, and I am listening." After supper, while the tables were being cleared and the men were gathering around a fire to talk business and smoke, and the women were settling into the domestic conversation that gathered naturally at the edges of such events, Milton Merritt came to find her. He did not approach her with the practiced ease of a man performing a social ritual. He walked toward her with the directness of someone who has made a decision and intends to follow it through, and he stopped 2 feet away and said, without preamble, "Miss Aldridge, I am Milton Merritt. I run the Merritt cattle operation, which borders the Hargrove property to the north and east. I need to speak with you plainly if you are willing." Della looked at him in the lantern light. He was perhaps 32 or 33, she judged, with the kind of face that had been shaped by years of weather and hard work into something angular and reliable. His hands were large and calloused. He wore a plain dark jacket that had been brushed clean for the occasion. He was not performing anything. He was simply there, present and purposeful, and the quality of his attention was like standing in a shaft of direct sunlight. "I am very willing," Della said. They walked to the edge of the firelight together, far enough from the other guests that their conversation was private, and there, standing in the warm Kansas night with the sound of the party behind them and the dark prairie stretching out ahead, Milton Merritt told her what he knew. He had been in Caldwell, the town, 6 weeks ago on cattle business. He had stopped at the post office to collect his mail, and behind the counter, in the familiar absent-minded way of a man who handles too many letters in too short a time, the postmaster had set down an open envelope next to Milton's stack of correspondence. Milton had not read it deliberately, but the name had caught his eye, and in the 2 seconds before the postmaster snatched it back with an apology, Milton had seen enough. A letter from someone in Caldwell County to a woman named Della Aldridge in St. Joseph, Missouri, signed with a woman's name, except the handwriting was not a woman's hand. Milton had seen Ezra Hargrove's handwriting on enough fence agreement documents and cattle sale receipts over the years to recognize it at 20 paces, the controlled leftward slant of it. The way the capital letters sat just slightly too upright, like a man trying to appear more formal than he was. He had thought about it for 6 weeks. He had wondered if it was his business. He had told himself more than once that men made strange arrangements for domestic help, and that it was not his place to interfere in his neighbor's household matters. He had almost convinced himself, right up until he looked down that harvest table tonight and saw a young woman sitting alone at the end of it, unintroduced and unacknowledged, with a composure in her face that told him she was holding something very difficult very tightly together. "I should have acted sooner," he said. "I am sorry for that." Della was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled behind them. Somewhere in the dark, a horse shifted and stamped. "You acted when you could," she said finally, "and you acted. That is more than most people do." She told him the rest of it then, the dead woman's letter, the tack room, the 3 weeks of growing clarity about Ezra Hargrove's actual intentions. She told it plainly and without decoration, because she was not a woman who dealt in drama, and because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. Milton listened with his whole body, not looking away, not interrupting, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment that felt important. "He has not made any direct approach to you," he said. "Not in words," Della said. "He is a careful man." Milton nodded slowly. "He is, and he will be more direct now that he knows I've spoken to you." "What does that mean for me?" Della asked. "It means," Milton said, choosing his words with evident care, "that you need options. You need to know that you are not trapped here. Whatever you decide to do, whether you stay in Caldwell County or go back to Missouri or anything else, you should make that decision freely, not because you have no other choice." "And what options do I have?" she said. She was not being self-pitying, she was being practical. She was a woman alone on the Kansas frontier with $23 and a sewing basket, and practicality was the only currency she had. Milton looked out at the dark prairie for a moment. When he turned back to her, there was something careful and deliberate in his face. "My operation has grown considerably in the past 2 years. I have 8 men working for me permanently and additional hands through the driving season. I don't have anyone to manage the domestic side of the main house. Cooking, keeping, mending, that kind of work. I've been managing it myself and doing it poorly. I would offer you a fair wage, a private room in the main house, and a situation that is exactly what it is represented to be and nothing more." Della studied him. "And what is it represented to be?" "Employment," he said. "Honest and straightforward. Nothing else unless something else is ever freely chosen by both parties." The last part landed carefully, deliberately, and she felt the full weight of it. He was not pretending that the dynamic between a man and a woman on the frontier didn't exist. He was not pretending that there was no possibility of anything beyond employment. He was simply being clear that no such thing would ever be pressured or assumed or used as a condition of her security. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I will think on it tonight and give you my answer in the morning." He nodded once, and that was the end of their first conversation. She did not sleep much that night, lying in the converted tack room with the prairie wind moving through the gaps in the walls and the weight of her situation pressing down on her chest. She thought about Milton Merritt and what she had seen in his face and what she had heard in his voice. She thought about the difference between a trap set with false warmth and a door opened with plain honesty. She thought about her $23 and her sewing basket and the narrow life she had left behind in St. Joseph. By the time the gray light of dawn began to come through the small window above her cot, she had made her decision. She told Ezra Hargrove at breakfast, calmly and directly, that she had spoken with Mr. Merritt at the supper and had accepted a position at his ranch. She thanked him for the weeks of room and board and told him she would be ready to leave with her trunk within the hour if he could arrange the wagon. Ezra's face went through several things in quick succession. She watched the calculation in his small eyes, watched him weigh the various levers he might pull, and watched him realize, one by one, that she had already removed all of them. She had a new employer. She had spoken publicly with that employer at a gathering attended by 40 of the county's residents. She was not frightened and she was not asking his permission. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I am doing," Della said. She had her trunk packed in 40 minutes. Milton Merritt's operation sat 12 miles north of the Hargrove property on a long stretch of rolling grassland that ran to a creek on the eastern edge. The main house was a solid two-story structure built from local limestone and timber, functional rather than beautiful, but clean and well-maintained. There were 2 barns, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a smokehouse, a vegetable garden that had gone somewhat wild from insufficient attention, and a magnificent view of the open plains from the west-facing porch that Della stood on for a long moment after Milton helped carry her trunk inside. "It's remarkable," she said, looking out at the distance. "It's home," he said simply, and the way he said it told her everything about what the land meant to him. He showed her the room at the back of the upper floor, small but private, with a real window that faced east and a proper door with a lock. He showed her the kitchen, which was large and reasonably well stocked, but evidently the work of a man who had been feeding himself out of necessity rather than pleasure. He told her that the ranch hands took their meals in the bunkhouse, and that she was not expected to feed them, only the main house, which in practice meant Milton himself and any guests or business visitors. He gave her 3 days to settle in before he asked anything of her at all. In those 3 days, Della walked the property, learned the shape of the place, introduced herself to the 8 ranch hands, and began quietly and systematically to bring the domestic chaos of the main house into order. She scrubbed the kitchen floor and reorganized the pantry shelves. She took stock of what food stores they had and made a list of what was needed. She mended the curtains in the front room and replaced the cracked oil lamp glass in the hallway. On the 4th day, she made breakfast for 2, and when Milton came in from the morning work and sat down at the kitchen table and found a real meal waiting for him, his face did something that she held in her memory for a long time afterward. It was not an extravagant expression. He did not make a dramatic show of gratitude. He simply looked at the table and then at her and said, "Thank you, Miss Aldridge," in a voice that had something raw and genuine in it, and she understood that he had been more alone in this house than she had realized. "Della," she said, "please." He looked up. "Della," he said, and the name in his mouth was different from the way it had sounded across the harvest table, quieter, more careful, like something he was learning to hold. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most unexpectedly rich of Della's life. She had come to the Merritt Ranch as an employee, and she remained so, firmly, in the letter of things. But the living of it was something more complex and interesting than any employment she had known. The ranch was a working ecosystem, every day full of decisions and problems, and the specific demands of maintaining a cattle operation through the turning of the season. And Milton Merritt, she discovered, was a man who thought aloud. He would come in at midday for coffee and end up standing at the kitchen counter, talking through some problem with the north pasture fence or the price per head he had been offered by a buyer from Wichita, not asking her advice exactly, but thinking in her presence in a way that invited her into the process. She found herself responding. She found herself asking questions that turned out to be useful. She had grown up practical and observant, and she had a way of seeing the logic of a situation quickly, and Milton seemed to notice this and value it with a directness that was both unusual and deeply satisfying. "You have a good head for numbers," he told her one evening in late October, after she had pointed out an error in the price calculation he had been working through for a potential cattle sale. "My father was a bookkeeper," she said. "He taught me before I was 10. You should have been doing accounts," he said, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. "I was doing accounts," she said. "They just happened to be for a needle shop." He smiled at that. It was a slow smile that started in one corner of his mouth and moved carefully across his face, as though it was making sure of itself before it committed, and it changed his face entirely. She had not seen him smile before that moment. She found she wanted to see it again. October moved into November and the temperature dropped and the prairie grass went from gold to brown, and the sky turned the hard, bright blue of a Kansas winter beginning. The work of the ranch shifted into its cold season rhythm, and Della shifted with it, finding the domestic pattern of the household and settling into it with something that felt, cautiously, like belonging. She wrote to her former employer in St. Joseph to let her know she was well established. She bought fabric at the dry goods store in Caldwell and set up her sewing things in the small room adjacent to the kitchen. And within a month, she had word-of-mouth work from 3 neighboring farm wives who needed alterations and new garments before the winter social season. She had income of her own, separate from the household wage Milton paid her, and the independence this gave her was something she felt physically, as a loosening of a tension she had been carrying since she arrived in Kansas. She had not seen Ezra Hargrove since the morning she left his ranch, but she heard things. The county was not large, and its social network was the kind that circulated information efficiently. Agnes Caldwell, the farmer's wife who had introduced herself at the harvest supper and become Della's first sewing customer and gradually a genuine friend, told her in early November that Ezra had written to a domestic agency in Kansas City about a housekeeper. Agnes said this with a meaningful look that communicated everything she did not say aloud. "He gave up quickly," Della said. "He is a practical man," Agnes said. "When a door closes, he finds another one." "That is a generous description," Della said. Agnes laughed. She was a tall woman with a dry wit and a complete absence of pretension, and Della was glad to know her. The friendship between Della and Milton grew in the particular way that friendships grow between 2 people who spend their days in proximity, and who are both honest enough not to pretend that the growing isn't happening. It grew through breakfasts and evening conversations on the porch, and through the long hours of a November rainstorm when they both ended up in the front room, Della sewing and Milton going through his account books, and found that the shared silence between them was as comfortable as conversation. It grew through the day. A heifer got stuck in the creek mud, and it took 4 of them 2 hours of work in the freezing water to get her free. And Della had waded in without being asked because there were not enough hands. And afterward Milton had wrapped her wet shoulders in his jacket without speaking, and the warmth of it went through her like a current. It grew through the evening. She made a molasses cake for no particular reason, and Milton ate 2 slices, and then said, very quietly, that his mother used to make molasses cake on winter evenings, and he hadn't thought about that in years. And for a moment something moved across his face that was old and private and tender. And Della set her fork down and listened to the story of his mother and his childhood in northern Texas, and the way the ranch had come to him through years of hard work after his parents were gone. And she told him about her own parents in return, and the evening turned into something irreplaceable. The thing she noticed most about Milton Merritt, the thing that separated him from every man she had known before, was that he listened to her the way he listened to everything else that mattered to him, with full attention and without any underlying agenda. He was not gathering information to use. He was not performing interest. He was simply and genuinely interested, in the way that a person is interested in something they are beginning to love, though neither of them would have used that word yet. There was a night in late November when Della woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of something wrong outside, a high, distressed sound that resolved itself, as she came fully awake, into the voice of a calf in difficulty. She pulled on her coat and boots and went outside and found Milton already there in the barn, working by lamplight, his sleeves rolled up in the cold, helping a first-calf heifer through a difficult labor. He did not seem surprised to see her. She knelt in the straw beside him and held the lamp and did what he asked, passing things, steadying things, and at the end of it, in the gray hour before dawn, there was a small wet calf standing on unsteady legs while its mother turned to investigate it, and Milton sat back on his heels and let out a long, slow breath and looked at Della across the lamplight. "Thank you," he said, and this time the words carried a weight that was about more than the calf. "Of course," she said. They were still in the barn, and the lamp was still burning, and neither of them stood up to leave, and in the quality of the pause between them something shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way such things happen in stories where there is a sudden revelation and a sudden declaration. It shifted the way the light shifts in early morning, gradually and completely, so that by the time you notice it, it has already been different for a while. "Della," Milton said, and his voice was different again, carrying that careful quality she had noticed before, the quality of a man who chooses words the way he chooses his steps in uncertain terrain. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly." She waited. "I don't want you to feel any pressure from the situation," he said. "You are here as your own person, and your employment here is settled regardless of anything I am about to say. I want you to know that first." "I know it," she said. "Go ahead." He looked at her with that direct gray gaze. "I am finding that I look forward to your company more than I can account for by simple friendship. And I believe that is a thing worth saying plainly, because I was raised to believe that honest things are better spoken than held." Della felt the warmth of it move through her, unhurried and deep, like the first real heat of spring after a long winter. She had known something was building between them. She had known it and been careful with it and turned it over quietly in her private thoughts for weeks. But hearing him say it, in his plain and earnest way, in a cold barn at 4 in the morning with straw in her hair and a newborn calf wobbling 3 feet away from them, was one of the most genuinely beautiful things that had ever happened to her. "I find the same," she said. "And I am glad you said it plainly, because I value plainness in a person." He smiled again, that slow, careful smile, and in the lamplight it was extraordinary. "I was hoping you did," he said. "I'm not a complicated man, Della. I don't have hidden motives or secret schemes. What I am is right in front of you." "I know," she said. "That is why I am not afraid of this." They did not rush anything after that. They were both practical people who understood that feeling something and building something are different projects with different timelines. What changed was simply that the feeling was named, acknowledged, held in the open where both of them could see it. The conversations on the porch became longer. The small attentions they paid each other became more deliberate. He brought her wildflowers once, late-season goldenrod and dried blue chicory, with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who knows the gesture is simple and means it anyway. She made his favorite foods when she could figure out what they were by watching what made him eat slowly and with attention. He taught her to read the sky the way ranchers read it, the subtle language of clouds and wind direction that tells you what the weather is planning. She taught him to play cribbage, which she had learned from her father, and they played most evenings after supper, and the game became a kind of conversation of its own. December arrived with its full weight of cold, and the ranch settled into its winter operations. The cattle were moved to the south pastures where they had better wind protection. The ranch hands worked reduced hours, and Milton spent more time with the account books and the planning of the coming year's operations. The evenings were long and dark and close. It was in December that the situation with Ezra Hargrove reasserted itself, and reasserted itself badly. Ezra had not, as Agnes suggested, simply found another door. He had been watching. The county's social network that kept Della informed of the goings-on at the Hargrove Ranch also kept Ezra informed of the growing closeness between Della and Milton. And Ezra Hargrove was not a man who accepted the removal of something he had considered his without consequences. He came to the Merritt Ranch on a cold December morning, unannounced, riding up to the front porch with the settled air of a man conducting official business. Della saw him coming through the kitchen window and felt the cold feeling move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She went to find Milton, who was in the barn. Milton came out to meet Ezra on the porch, and Della stood in the front doorway because this was her home now and she would not be made invisible in it again. Ezra made his speech quickly and without apparent embarrassment. He had a document, he said, that he had drawn up with the assistance of the county clerk. A claim of breach of implied contract, he called it, asserting that Della had been brought to Caldwell County under terms that constituted a binding domestic arrangement, and that her departure and subsequent employment at a competing ranch had caused him material damage. He was not seeking legal remedy at this time, he said. He was seeking a discussion. Della felt the cold move from her chest to her spine. It was exactly the kind of trap she should have anticipated. A claim like that, even a spurious one, even one that would never survive any serious legal scrutiny, could cause enormous social damage. In 1883 in Kansas, a woman's reputation was her most fragile and most essential possession. A public dispute involving contractual obligations and competing households and men's property interests would not reflect badly on the men involved. It would destroy her. Milton looked at the document Ezra was holding. He did not take it. He stood very still on the porch with his hands at his sides, and he looked at Ezra Hargrove with an expression that Della had never seen on his face before. It was not angry, exactly. It was harder than anger. It was the expression of a man who has seen something clearly and decided what to do about it. "You wrote a letter to Della under your dead wife's name," Milton said. "I know that because I saw the letter at the post office before it was sealed. And I know your handwriting, Ezra. I know it well." The morning was completely still. A crow called somewhere out over the pasture. "That is a serious accusation," Ezra said carefully. "It's a fact," Milton said. "And you know it's a fact. You brought a woman here under false pretenses, you housed her in conditions that were not what was represented to her, and you kept her socially isolated with the intention of manufacturing dependency. And now that she has found honest employment and a situation that actually suits her, you have come here with a paper designed to threaten her reputation if she does not return to your sphere of influence." Ezra said nothing. "I will say this to you once," Milton said, and his voice was very quiet, which made it more, not less, serious. "If you file that document with the county clerk, I will file my own account of events with the county recorder's office, in writing, with a copy sent to the regional federal agent in Wichita, documenting everything I know about the letter and the circumstances of Della's hiring. And I will speak to every man in this county who does business with you and tell them what I know. Now you are a practical man. Calculate your interests accordingly." The silence stretched. Della looked at Ezra Hargrove's face and watched the calculation happen behind his small eyes, watched him assess Milton's steadiness and weigh it against his own position, watched him understand that Milton was not performing, that he would do exactly what he had said. Ezra looked at the document in his hand. He looked at Milton. He looked briefly at Della, and she met his gaze and did not look away. Then he folded the document, put it in his coat pocket, turned his horse, and rode back down the track toward the road without a word. Della let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like a very long time. She looked at Milton, who was still standing on the porch, and the expression on his face had shifted from that hard steadiness into something that looked very much like relief, and also like vulnerability, like a man who has done what needed to be done and is now aware of how much was at stake. She crossed the porch and stood beside him, and they watched the distant figure of Ezra Hargrove diminish along the track until he was gone. "Thank you," she said. "He won't come back," Milton said. "He is a man who only acts when he thinks the advantage is his. He doesn't have the advantage here, and he knows it." "You took a risk," she said, confronting him like that. Milton turned to look at her. "No," he said, "I didn't. The risk would have been letting him have power over you. That was not something I was willing to do." She looked at him for a long moment, standing in the cold December air on his limestone porch with the winter prairie behind him and the certainty in his face, and she felt something in her chest that was warm and deep and permanent. "Milton," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you had better kiss me," she said, "before I have to be sensible about this again." He looked at her for 1 second in which surprise and warmth and the slow, careful smile all competed for his face, and then he closed the distance between them and kissed her with exactly the quality she had come to expect from everything he did: deliberate, unhurried, and completely sincere. The Kansas winter was the setting for the deepest and most unexpected happiness of Della Aldridge's life, and she thought, more than once, how strange and unlikely the geography of a person's joy could be. She had not come to Kansas for this. She had come to Kansas for employment and escape, and the practical business of building a livable life in difficult circumstances. She had not planned on finding a man in whom plainness was a virtue, in whom the absence of hidden motives was itself the most extraordinary thing, a man whose idea of an endearment was to say her name as though it meant something. She thought about what it had felt like to be invisible at that harvest table. She thought about how the first act of seeing her had preceded every other thing that had happened between them, and how that was, in some way, the whole story in miniature. She had been invisible, and he had made her real, and everything that followed had simply been both of them becoming more fully themselves in the presence of that reality. Christmas came to the Merritt Ranch with a particular warmth that year. Agnes Caldwell and her husband James came for Christmas supper, bringing their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who ran through the downstairs rooms and made a beautiful noise. Della cooked a feast using the best of the winter stores: a roasted haunch of pork, sweet potatoes with molasses, cornbread and dried berry preserves, and a spiced apple cake that Milton ate with such unembarrassed pleasure that everyone at the table laughed. Agnes caught Della's eye across the table, with a look of such warm congratulation that Della had to look away to keep the emotion in her face from becoming too obvious. After supper, when the children had fallen asleep in various corners and James and Agnes were wrapped in their coats on the porch talking quietly, Milton and Della stood in the kitchen doing the washing up side by side, which was one of those domestic intimacies that seems small and is enormous. And Milton said, very quietly, "I would like to ask you something important, Della, and I want to wait until the moment is right. And I have been trying to determine when the moment is right for approximately 6 weeks." Della set down the dish she was drying and looked at him. His profile was lit by the oil lamp on the counter, and he was looking at the dishpan with an expression of intense concentration, as though the answer to the timing question might be found in the soapy water. "Milton," she said gently. "Yes, the moment is now." He turned to look at her. He had slightly soapy hands and there was a dish towel over one shoulder, and he looked utterly and completely himself, which was to say earnest and solid and the finest thing she had ever seen. "Della Aldridge," he said, "I would like you to be my wife, not because of the household or the ranch or the practical good it would do either of us, but because the day I heard your name for the first time and the day I decided I needed to say it aloud so the rest of the room would know you existed, were the beginning of something that I do not want to live without. You are the best thing in my life. You are probably the best thing that has ever been in this house, and I think we could build something remarkable together if you are willing." She was crying before he finished, the quiet kind of crying that has nothing of grief in it, only the overflow of feeling that has been held carefully for months and has finally found its moment. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. Obviously, from the moment you said my name in a room full of strangers who had been pretending I didn't exist." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and kissed her, still with the slightly soapy hands, and she laughed into the kiss and held him tightly and thought, with the complete and settled clarity of a person who has found where they belong, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in February of 1884, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, with Agnes and James Caldwell as witnesses, and the 8 ranch hands in their best shirts crowded into the pews looking scrubbed and slightly overwhelmed by the occasion. The minister was a young man named Reverend Cole, who was newer to Kansas than either Milton or Della, and who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and only one small stumble over the pronunciation of Aldridge, which he immediately corrected, and which earned him silent forgiveness from both parties. Della wore a dress she had made herself from deep blue wool, fitted at the waist with pearl buttons down the front that she had ordered from a catalog in St. Louis. Milton wore his good dark suit and a white shirt she had ironed that morning, and when he saw her come down the church aisle his face did that thing it did sometimes. The thing where everything in him was visible because he had no mechanism for hiding it. And she felt the warmth of being seen by him as acutely as she had that first night at the harvest table. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at the Caldwell home with cake and cider and fiddle music that got louder as the evening went on. And Della danced with Milton on the Caldwell's parlor floor for the first time and discovered that he was a serious dancer, taking the steps with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, determined to do it correctly and finding, after a few minutes, that correctness had given way to genuine enjoyment. "You are a very good dancer," she told him. "My mother made me learn," he said. "She said a man who couldn't dance would never find a wife." "Your mother was a very wise woman," Della said. "She was," he said, and the way he said it was both simple and full, and she squeezed his hand and they danced on. The spring of 1884 was one of the finest on record in Caldwell County. The rains came on time and in good measure, the grass on the Merritt Range came up thick and green, and the cattle herd, which Milton had been building methodically for 4 years, was in excellent condition. The cattle market in Dodge City was strong, and the outlook for the driving season was good. Milton rode out on his range in April mornings with a satisfaction in his face that Della recognized because she felt it herself, the satisfaction of a life that is working. Their first real argument happened in April, which is as good a time as any for a first real argument, when the world is green enough to weather it. It was about the North Pasture, specifically about whether Milton's plan to expand the herd into it before the fence repairs were complete was sound practice. Della had the numbers in front of her, because she had taken over the ranch accounts in January, and done it with a precision and clarity that had made Milton look at the ledgers with the expression of a man who had not known what he was missing. The numbers said the fence repairs needed to come first. Milton said he had been running cattle on this range for 4 years and knew its rhythms, and sometimes the numbers told you less than the land told you. They argued about it for 40 minutes, both of them fully engaged and neither giving ground, and at the end of it, they came to an agreement that was a genuine compromise. The fence repairs on the most critical sections would be completed first, and the herd expansion would happen in stages. It was, Della thought, the most satisfying argument she had ever had because it was an argument between equals, two people with different and legitimate knowledge, neither of whom was performing or posturing or trying to win at the expense of the other. They were solving a problem together. That was the quality of their life. That was the texture of it. They were solving things together. In May, Della discovered she was expecting a child. She told Milton on a Sunday morning, sitting on the west-facing porch with their coffee, watching the light come across the plains. She told him simply, directly, in the same manner that she approached everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and turned to look at her with that face of his, that face where everything was visible, and there was such raw and unguarded joy in it that she had to reach out and take his hand because the sight of it was almost too much to hold at a distance. "Della," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" He said immediately, practically, which was exactly right. "I am very well," she said. "I feel extraordinary, in fact. Although I have been informed by Agnes that this may not continue." Agnes had indeed provided a comprehensive briefing on the full terrain of pregnancy, delivered with Agnes's characteristic directness, and Della had received it gratefully. Agnes had 3 children and a practical intelligence about such matters, and was genuinely delighted about the coming addition to the Merritt household. The summer of 1884 unfolded slowly and brilliantly. The cattle drive went well. Milton and 3 of his men took the herd north to Dodge City in June and came back in July with a price that exceeded their projections. Della ran the ranch in his absence with the assistance of the remaining hands and found, to her own amusement and satisfaction, that it ran quite well under her management, a fact she mentioned to Milton on his return with enough pointed understatement that he caught it immediately and responded with a laugh. "I never doubted it," he said, which was both diplomatic and, she believed, entirely true. She continued her sewing work through the summer, adapting her techniques as her body changed, and found that the work itself was a kind of peace, the familiar rhythm of needle and thread, and the practical transformation of cloth into something shaped and purposeful. She made things for the coming baby with a quiet joy that was different from all other joys she knew, more interior and more foundational, the joy of making something that did not yet exist for a person who did not yet exist in the world. Ezra Hargrove, it should be said, had not in fact simply gone away after December. He had gone quiet, which in a man like Ezra was a different thing. In August, word reached Della through Agnes that Ezra had been telling a version of events around the county that was noticeably different from what had actually occurred, a version in which Della had left his employ unexpectedly and without cause, and in which Milton's role was characterized with implications that were insulting to both of them. It was the weapon he had chosen, having abandoned the legal approach, the slow erosion of reputation through insinuation. Milton heard about it on the same day Della did, from a different source. He came home that evening and they sat down at the kitchen table and talked about it the way they talked about everything, honestly and directly and without drama. "It will run its course," Milton said. "People who know us will know the truth. People who don't know us will form whatever opinion they form, and there is not much we can do about that except live well and let the evidence accumulate." "I am not afraid of it," Della said. "I am angry about it, which is different." "You are allowed to be angry," he said. "I am not interested in his version of my life," she said. "I know what happened. You know what happened. Agnes and James and everyone who has actually been present knows what happened. Let him tell his story. I have mine." Milton looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was equal parts warmth and admiration, and said, "You are the most clear-headed person I have ever known." "I had good reasons to become clear-headed," she said. "Being invisible in a room full of people has a way of sharpening the mind." It was in the autumn of 1884, as the harvest season came around again, and the first anniversary of the harvest supper at the Hargrove Ranch approached, that the matter of Ezra Hargrove was finally and completely resolved. It was resolved not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the ordinary operations of community knowledge and time. Two events occurred in close succession that effectively ended Ezra's credibility in Caldwell County. The first was that the woman he had hired from the Kansas City agency, a widow named Mrs. Pearl Farrow, left his employ after 2 months and, upon being asked by several of the county women why she had left, told them plainly that the conditions of her employment had not matched what she had been told to expect, and that Mr. Hargrove had certain expectations of a domestic employee that went beyond the bounds of what was professional or appropriate. Mrs. Pearl Farrow was a forthright woman of 45 with no social anxiety about speaking plainly, and she spoke very plainly. The county women, who were not without their own clear sight, drew their conclusions. The second was that the county land agent, who had been sitting next to Milton at the harvest supper the previous year, and who had been a witness to the gathering, without quite understanding its significance, came to see Milton in October with a land survey matter and mentioned, in the course of their conversation, that Ezra Hargrove had apparently presented certain property boundary documents to the county office that appeared to contain alterations inconsistent with the original survey records. This was a matter for the county recorder and, potentially, for legal proceedings, and it absorbed Ezra's attention and energy entirely and completely for the next several months, leaving him with neither the time nor the standing to maintain his campaign of insinuation about the Merritt household. By December of 1884, Ezra Hargrove was consumed with a property dispute that would drag through the county record's office for 2 years, and that would ultimately find against him in ways that significantly reduced his holdings. His reputation in the county had shifted from that of a successful and established rancher to that of a man about whom people privately said that there was something not quite right, and that they had suspected it for some time. Della heard about all of it and felt, quietly, that justice in this life moved slowly and sideways and not always in the direction you expected, but that it moved. The baby arrived on a cold morning in November of 1884, 3 weeks earlier than expected, which meant that the county doctor was away in Wichita, and Agnes Caldwell, who had attended 2 of her neighbors' births and her sister-in-law's difficult one, stepped in with tremendous calm competence and talked Della through every minute of it. Milton, who had been explicitly told to wait in the front room, lasted 30 minutes before he appeared in the bedroom doorway with an expression of barely controlled alarm, and Agnes looked at him over her shoulder and said, "Either be useful or be elsewhere," and Milton chose useful. The baby was a boy, 7 pounds, with a pair of lungs that he immediately demonstrated could be heard from the front porch. They named him Thomas William Merritt, Thomas for Milton's father and William for Della's father, and the combination of the names seemed right, honoring both the lives that had shaped them. Milton held his son for the first time standing at the bedroom window in the thin November light, and the expression on his face was one that Della would carry with her for the rest of her life. She was exhausted and wrung out and propped up on pillows in the bed, watching him, and she thought that this was the real harvest, not the corn and the cattle and the winter stores. This, the accumulation of honest living into something you could hold. Thomas William Merritt was a vigorous and demanding infant who slept in inconsiderate intervals and expressed his opinions with remarkable force for someone who weighed just over 7 pounds. His parents loved him with the complete and unreasonable totality that is the particular gift of new parenthood, and the ranch adjusted itself around the new small center of gravity with a kind of communal warmth. The 8 ranch hands, who were collectively a rough assortment of men from various backgrounds and circumstances, displayed an unexpected collective softness about the baby. The foreman, a quiet Mexican man named Rafael Vargas, who had been with Milton for 3 years, and who had the dignified reserve of a person who has seen considerable hardship, came to the door of the main house with a carved wooden rattle he had made himself during the winter evenings, presented it to Della with a brief bow and a few quiet words, and refused any acknowledgement of the gesture beyond a nod. Christmas of 1884 was the happiest occasion Della could remember, and she had sufficiently good and clear memory to make this a meaningful statement. The Caldwells came again with their children, and the children this time had a baby to look at, which occupied them considerably. Agnes cooked alongside Della in the kitchen, and they talked and laughed in the easy way of friends who have known each other long enough to be entirely themselves together. James and Milton sat by the fire and discussed the land prices and the cattle market and the expanding territory of the railroad, and the conversation was animated and good-natured and punctuated by the sounds of the children, and eventually by Thomas, who had decided that Christmas was a fine occasion for maximum lung exercise. Milton and Della lay in bed that night after the house was quiet, Thomas asleep in his crib across the room, and Della thought about the harvest table a year ago and the thin, frightened clarity of sitting invisible among strangers, and the moment a man she had never met had said her name and changed the direction of her life. She thought about how the things that turn your life entirely are often so small in the moment. A name spoken aloud, a pair of eyes that stop on you and stay. "Milton," she said softly, in case he was asleep. He said, which meant he was not. "I was thinking about last year," she said, "about the harvest supper." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it too," he said. "I think about what would have happened if I had kept my mouth shut." "Why didn't you?" she asked. It was a question she had not asked directly before, and she found she wanted the full answer now, in this quiet and settled moment. He turned his head to look at her. The room was dark, but she knew his face well enough to read it in darkness. "Because I had been carrying the weight of knowing something and not doing anything about it for 6 weeks," he said. And because you were sitting there in that lantern light with your hands in your lap and your back straight and your face perfectly composed, and I could see exactly what that composure was costing you. And I thought, if I do not say this woman's name right now, I am exactly the same as every other person at this table who has decided that their own comfort matters more than her dignity. She was quiet for a moment, and that was all it was, she said. Conscience. He made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something more honest. No, he said. It was also that you were the most interesting person in that room, and I wanted you to turn and look at me. She laughed soft enough not to wake Thomas. Milton Merritt, she said. Yes, he said. You are the best person I know, she said. He took her hand under the blankets and held it with the calm certainty of a man who has found what he was looking for and intends to hold it. The feeling is entirely mutual, he said. The years that followed built on each other with a steady and satisfying accumulation that was the texture of a life well made. The Merritt cattle operation continued to grow, and Milton's reputation in the county as a fair and trustworthy man of business was established thoroughly enough that it weathered everything Ezra Hargrove's diminished influence had thrown at it, and then surpassed it. Della's sewing business grew as well, not just in the practical sense of more customers and more work, but in scope. By 1886, she was making garments for women in Caldwell and several of the surrounding communities, and she had a particular specialty in wedding dresses and baptismal gowns that gave her work a significance in people's lives that she valued deeply. She was present, in the way that a skilled seamstress is always present, for the important moments of other people's most important days. She also took on the ranch accounts permanently, and expanded them into something considerably more sophisticated than the basic ledger Milton had maintained. She tracked costs and revenues across multiple seasons, identified patterns in the cattle market that informed their buying and selling decisions, and built a financial picture of the operation that was detailed enough to provide real security. Milton trusted her judgment in this area completely, and the trust was not passive. He engaged with the numbers, asked questions, brought his own knowledge of the land and the cattle to bear on her projections, and together they made decisions that were better than either of them would have made alone. Thomas William grew from a demanding infant into a curious and active small boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's precise attention to things, who spent his first 3 years investigating every corner of the ranch with thorough and occasionally alarming thoroughness. He was followed in November of 1886 by a second child, another boy, who they named James Raphael, James for their friend James Caldwell, and Raphael for the foreman whose quiet dignity had been such a steady presence at the ranch through all their years. Raphael Vargas, when he was told of the middle name, stood very still for a moment and then turned slightly away, and when he turned back his face was composed in its usual reserve, but his eyes were bright, and Milton shook his hand and said nothing else because nothing else was needed. The two boys were different in the ways that siblings are different when they are close in age. Thomas methodical and observant, James Raphael quick and loud, and irresistibly charming from the moment he was born. The house filled with the particular energy of small children, and adapted itself around them with the resilience that a house acquires when it is genuinely lived in. Agnes Caldwell said, sitting at Della's kitchen table in the spring of 1887 drinking coffee while their children made noise somewhere in the back of the house, "You look different from when I first met you." "I hope so," Della said. "When you first met me I was sitting at the wrong end of a table being invisible." "You were not invisible to yourself," Agnes said. "That was the thing. You had that look that a person has when they are very specifically deciding not to be destroyed by something." "Was it that obvious?" Della said. "Only to another woman," Agnes said. They drank their coffee. The sound of Thomas and Agnes's oldest boy in some vigorous disagreement about something drifted in from the yard. "Are you happy?" Agnes asked, in the direct way that Agnes asked things. Della considered the question seriously, as she always considered serious questions. "Yes," she said. "Not in the way that happiness is described in the kind of novels I used to read in St. Joseph, where it is very large and very obvious. In the way that something that is true, consistently and without requiring you to keep proving it." Agnes nodded. "That is the best kind," she said. In the summer of 1887, the Kansas heat was punishing, and the cattle ranges were dry, and there were several weeks in August when water management was the whole of Milton's attention and anxiety. He rode his range every morning checking the creek levels and the condition of the stock, and came home in the evenings dusty and tight-faced with the particular worry of a man whose livelihood runs on legs that need water to survive. Della kept his meals ready and his coffee hot and his accounts current, and asked him every evening what she could do, and listened to his answers, and found practical ways to be useful that were not about coddling him or managing his worry, but about standing shoulder to shoulder with it. The rains came back in September, as they always came back eventually, and the range recovered, and the cattle were fine, and Milton sat on the porch one evening in the first cool air of autumn and let out a long breath that carried with it everything he had been holding for 2 months. "It's all right," he said. "It is," Della said, sitting beside him. "I always know it will be," he said, "and I can never quite believe it in the middle of it." "That is what the middle of things is for," she said. "The ends are easy, the middle is the work." He turned and looked at her with that look of his, the one she knew better than any other look in the world. "How did you get so wise?" he said. "I sat at the wrong end of a lot of tables," she said, and he laughed, which was the whole point. The anniversary of the harvest supper became, over the years, a private observance between the two of them, a day in September when the harvest season was coming on, and the light had that particular quality of early autumn gold, when they would sometimes simply acknowledge to each other what the day meant, not with ceremony, with the particular attention that you give to things that are foundational. In September of 1888, on the 5th anniversary of the Hargrove Harvest Supper, Della and Milton rode out together on horseback in the evening to the high ridge at the north end of the Merritt Range, which gave the widest view of their property and the surrounding country. They had done this before, on evenings when the boys were with Agnes or settled with Raphael's wife, a capable young woman named Elena who had become part of the extended household in the past year. They sat on their horses side by side at the top of the ridge in the gold and copper light, looking out over the land that was theirs, the buildings of the ranch house and the barns small in the distance, the creek catching light to the east, the pastures moving in the slow wind. "It's a fine thing," Della said. "It is," Milton said. "You have built something real here," she said. "We have," he said, quietly, without emphasis, as a fact. She looked at his profile in the evening light, the weathered face and the steady eyes, the man she had found at the far end of a table full of strangers who could not be bothered to say her name. She thought about all the things that had been dark and frightening and uncertain, and how every one of them had led to this ridge and this light and this person beside her. "Milton," she said. "Yes." "I am glad you said my name," she said. He turned to look at her. The evening light was full and golden, and it moved across his face with that same quality of gradual change that she had noticed the very first morning she had seen it, the light of a country that does not apologize for being what it is. "Della Aldridge," he said, very deliberately, as though he was saying it for the first time again, and the name in his mouth was a whole history, an acknowledgment, a love letter compressed into 3 syllables. "I am glad I said it too." She reached across the space between their horses and he took her hand, and they sat on the ridge in the evening light above everything they had built together, and the wind moved across the grass in long, slow waves, and the world was quiet and full, and entirely, completely their own. The third pregnancy arrived in the winter of 1888, and this time it was a daughter, born in March of 1889, smaller than either of her brothers had been, but with an expression from the first hour of her life that suggested she was prepared to be entirely underestimated, and intended to use that to her advantage. They named her Clara May Merritt. Clara because Milton said the name suited her, and because both of them liked the clarity of it, and May for the spring that was just beginning to come into the Kansas land outside the window when she arrived. Thomas William, who was 4 years old and very serious about everything, examined his new sister with the thoroughness of a child who had decided that the world required careful inspection, and announced that she had good hands. James Raphael, who was 2.5 and not serious about anything, climbed into Della's bed and pressed his face against the baby's head, and breathed her in with the unself-conscious wonder of a very small child encountering something entirely new. The house expanded further in spirit, in warmth, in noise and purpose. Rafael Vargas had by this time been with the ranch for 7 years, and was, in every practical sense, as much a part of the household as any of the family. His wife Alina had become Della's closest day-to-day companion after Agnes, the two women moving through the domestic logistics of two households, with the practiced ease of people who have learned to trust each other's competence and character. Raphael and Milton ran the range operations together with the calm efficiency of two people who understand each other's methods so thoroughly that they barely need to speak. The Caldwell County of 1889 was a different place from the one Della had arrived in 6 years earlier. The railroad had come closer, bringing goods and news and new settlers. The trail driving era was contracting as the railheads moved closer to the ranches, and the open range gave way to fenced land and more settled operations. Milton had been watching these changes and planning around them for 2 years, transitioning the operation away from long trail drives toward more local and regional sales, building relationships with buyers who came to them rather than chasing the Dodge City market north each summer. The transition required exactly the kind of combined knowledge that Milton and Della brought to the operation together. His understanding of cattle and land, hers of numbers and markets, and the logic of changing conditions. They sat at the kitchen table on winter evenings, with the account books between them and the children asleep upstairs, and worked through the future of their operation with the absorbed attention of two people who are doing something they are genuinely good at together. By 1890, the Merritt operation was more profitable on smaller herd numbers than it had been on larger ones in the early years of the decade, a fact that Della pointed out to Milton with the specific satisfaction of a person whose projection had proven correct, and that Milton acknowledged with a smile, and the statement that he had never in his life been so pleased to be told he was right. The matter of the schools was one that both of them cared about with the particular intensity of people who had educated themselves against the grain of their circumstances, and who understood what education meant for a child's possibilities. There was a county school in Caldwell, but it was 12 miles away, which was manageable in summer and difficult in winter, and the quality of the instruction was inconsistent. In 1890, Della joined a committee of county women, Agnes among them, who were advocating for a second school district to serve the rural ranching communities north of town. She attended the county commissioner meetings and presented the financial case for the school with the same clarity and precision she brought to the ranch accounts, and when the commissioner attempted to dismiss her figures with a vague wave and a comment about the complexity of county budget matters, she set the ledger pages on the table in front of him and asked him to point to the error. He could not find one. The second school district was approved in the fall of 1890. Thomas Williams started at the new school in the autumn of 1891, riding with Raphael's oldest boy on a horse that Milton had picked for its consistent temperament, and Della had spent 3 weeks making sure Thomas knew how to handle. He came home from the first day with the expression of a person who has discovered that the world contains more to know than they had previously estimated, which was exactly what his parents had hoped for. Clara May, at 2 years old, watched her older brothers with an expression that said clearly that she intended to catch up with them as quickly as possible and had already formed a plan. The winter of 1891 brought the kind of Kansas blizzard that happens once or twice in a decade. 3 days of driving snow and wind that confined the whole of the Merritt household inside and required continuous effort to keep the livestock from crisis. Milton and Raphael and the hands worked around the clock in shifts to maintain the animals, coming in cold and exhausted to eat and warm themselves before going back out. Della kept the kitchen running on a continuous basis, hot food and coffee always available, and managed the main house with a calm efficiency that kept everything else functional while the outdoor work consumed the men. On the third night of the blizzard, when the worst of it was finally breaking and the wind was falling off to a moan rather than a roar, Milton came in at midnight, his outer coat stiff with ice, and sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee Della put in front of him and looked at her across the table with an exhaustion that was bone-deep but still somehow warm. "All right?" she asked. "All right," he said. "We lost 2 calves. Everything else is fine." "I'm sorry about the calves," she said. "It happens," he said. He drank the coffee slowly. The house was very quiet around them, the children asleep, the wind dying down to something ordinary outside. "Della," he said. "Yes." "I want you to know something," he said, with the deliberate quality he had when he was saying something he had been thinking about carefully. "This life that we have made here, I know it is hard sometimes. I know the winters are long and the work is relentless, and this country is not the gentlest place in the world." She waited. "I want you to know that every difficulty in it is made manageable by the fact that you are in it with me," he said. "I was here for 4 years before you came, and I thought I was content, and it turns out I didn't know what contentment was." She reached across the table and put her hand over his cold, calloused one. "I know," she said. "I feel the same." "I just wanted to say it," he said. "I'm glad you said it," she said. "I am always glad when you say things." He turned his hand over and held hers. The kitchen clock marked the minutes in the quiet house. Outside, the last of the blizzard was settling into ordinary winter silence, and the prairie was white and still and immense under the clearing sky, and the Merritt ranch sat in it solid and warm and full of everything that 2 people can build when they build honestly and completely together. They sat at the kitchen table in the small hours of the night, holding hands across the worn oak surface, and the lamp burned steady between them, and above them their children slept in the good warmth of a house that had been made into a home by the daily accumulation of care and honesty, and the particular kind of love that does not announce itself dramatically but simply persists and grows and holds, and is sufficient for everything. Della Aldridge had come to Kansas on a false promise and found a true one. She had arrived invisible and been made visible by the one act of simple human recognition that had started everything. A man who looked down a long table and decided that her name deserved to be spoken aloud in a room full of people who had not thought to say it. She had found in this man the full and rare thing of being known. Not the version of herself she performed for the world, but the actual person. The one who had clear eyes and a good head for numbers and a grief or 2 that she did not speak about freely, and a capacity for joy that had been waiting quietly for the right conditions to come into its full expression. And Milton Merritt, who had said her name first, who had held her employment and her dignity and her future in the careful and honest hands that held everything he valued, had found in her the thing that the Kansas land in all its immensity and all its beauty had not been able to give him on its own, a person to share it with who was equal to it, who was equal to him, who would stand on a high ridge in the evening light or sit at a kitchen table in the small hours of a blizzard and be entirely, genuinely, unfailingly present. The story of Della and Milton Merritt was not a story about rescue. It was a story about recognition, about the extraordinary and ordinary power of saying someone's name in a room that had been pretending they weren't there, about what follows from that single act of acknowledgement when both people are willing to be brave enough to let it become everything it has the potential to be. Thomas William grew up to be a rancher and a careful thinker, both of which suited him perfectly, and he eventually took on a partnership in the Merritt operation that carried it forward into the next generation. James Raphael grew up to be a lawyer in Caldwell, sharp-tongued and warm-hearted and entirely impossible to intimidate, characteristics that made him very effective, and that made his parents simultaneously proud and occasionally exhausted. Clara May grew up to be a teacher, which surprised no one who had watched her from infancy, observing the world with that particular expression of a person who intends to understand everything and then share what she finds. And she taught at the school that her mother had helped to establish, which closed a circle in a way that Della found deeply satisfying. The Merritt Ranch remained, through all the changes of the coming years, a place of solidity and warmth. The limestone house stood against the Kansas weather. The range produced. The accounts, maintained with increasing sophistication as the decades turned, reflected a life that had been built on honest work and honest partnership. Rafael Vargas eventually built his own small house on a corner of the Merritt Range, a piece of land that Milton gave him in acknowledgement of the years of work and loyalty, a gesture that was unceremonious and complete in the way that all of Milton's gestures were unceremonious and complete. In later years, on September evenings when the harvest season came on and the light was gold and long over the plains, Della and Milton would sometimes sit together on the west-facing porch with their coffee and watch the evening come across the land, and there was in those moments the quiet fullness of a life that had been what it was supposed to be. Not easy, not without grief or hardship or the long difficult work of any real thing, but true, persistently, irrevocably, beautifully true. The harvest table of September 1883 stood in Della's memory, not as a moment of shame or danger, but as the beginning of everything that had mattered. The invisible woman at the end of the table holding herself together in the lantern light. The man at the center who looked up and looked down the length of the table and decided, for whatever complicated and simple combination of reasons, that her name deserved to be said aloud. Della Aldridge, 2 words, 3 syllables, the whole direction of a life, shifted in a moment so small that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. She had not missed it. She had never missed it. She carried it with her always, that moment of being called into existence by someone who had not met her and did not yet know her but had seen enough to understand that she was there, that she mattered, that her name was worth saying in a room full of people who had decided otherwise. And she had spent the rest of her life being grateful for it, and building something worthy of it, and loving the man who had said it with the whole and honest and unhesitating fullness of everything she was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, everything.